Right, so thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction. It's good to see a range of people some of whom I haven't seen for many years, others fairly recently. And as Martin said, I'm going to be looking at two late 20th century, late 19th century missionaries and their approach to Islam in Mombasa and Zanzibar. As Martin has already said, are places that I've been attached to in many ways, and I've spent time in over the last 40 odd years. Now let's try and persuade the slides to move forward. The paper that I'm going to present this afternoon is a work in progress, and it's being prepared for a keynote address at the Mission and Modernity Research Academy, which is being held in Leuven when pandemic allows. And the title of this academy is Christian-Muslim Missionary Interactions in the 19th and 20th Centuries. And I'm part of the organizing committee for it, but they asked me to give this paper when we meet. And that will be a week-long academy. The two people I'm going to talk about, one of them, William Taylor, I know far too much about, having written about him very many times over the last 20 years. Whereas the second one, Godfrey Dale, I've up till this point only focused on his Swahili version of the Quran. And so I know less about him. And lockdown has so far prevented me from using the Universities Missionaries to Central Africa, or UMCA archives in Oxford, to check on the details. I've mentioned archives there, and that's because much of the information that I'm going to be talking about now is drawn from the two missionary archives, and annual letters, reports, correspondence, as well as the published books and tracts of the two missionaries. Before we talk about these two missionaries, I want to give a little bit of background about East Africa in the 1890s, so the period where they were both there and working. Following the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, when Africa was carved up by European powers, and then a subsequent treaty between Britain, Germany, and the Sultan of Zanzibar, Mombasa, that was in 1887. Mombasa became a part of British Imperial East Africa, while Zanzibar became a British protectorate. But the mainland south of Mombasa was ceded to the Germans and became part of German East Africa. The population of the coastal areas and the islands consisted of many different African peoples, both those who were indigenous to the coast, but also upcountry people. But there had been a long connection with the Yemen, so there were many Hadrami Arabs there, and connection with South Asia. So there were Indians also there, and predating any British colonial importing of Indians. Islam had been present on the coast and the islands since almost the time of Muhammad, whilst Christianity had only had a brief presence during the Portuguese colonial period, 1500 to 1700. Christianity had been there, but then disappeared. And it wasn't until 1844, with the arrival of Ludwig Krapf, that modern Christian mission work resumed in East Africa. Many of the coastal people were familiar with Islam, but they were followers of African traditional religions, whereas Islam was represented not only by Sunni Islam and followers of the Shafi madhab, but also Shia and they were Ithna Ashari, Nizari, and Daud, whereas the Omani rulers of Zanzibar were Ibadi or Harajite. The lingua franca of the coast was Swahili, which had been written in Arabic script since at least the 17th century. However, Swahili has at least 16 distinct dialects. The two main ones being Kiunguja for Zanzibar and Kiemvita for Mombasa. Now to introduce our two missionaries. Firstly, William Ernest Taylor, a Church Missionary Society or CMS missionary who worked in Mombasa from 1880 to 1897. He was born in Worcester in 1856, so only a few miles from where I'm sitting, and went to school there before going to college, to Hertford College in Oxford. He graduated in 1878, then spent a year in Edinburgh studying medicine and working at Cowgate Dispensary. During this period, he then applied to CMS to work as a missionary and was made a deacon in the Church of England by the Bishop of Mauritius in London in the May of 1880. In the July, he traveled to East Africa, initially working in what is now Uganda in the Nyanza mission in Eastern Equatorial Africa. But then in the next year, in 1881, he transferred to Mombasa. And he stayed working in Mombasa on the island until 1884. This one is William Taylor. We will get reference to Mrs. Taylor and the Bazette sisters later on. In 1885, he was ordained priest in Mombasa by Bishop Hannington before Bishop Hannington travelled towards Uganda and was sadly killed. During Taylor's second tour, he was based in the various mission stations around in the countryside around Mombasa. In 1892, on leave, he married a lady called Catherine Tessiman, and they returned to live in Mombasa, where they worked together. They left East Africa in 1896, moving to work with CMS in Egypt and Sudan until 1904, when they returned to Britain, and he served in various parishes until his death in 1927. Our second missionary is Godfrey Dale, this rather smaller man in these two photographs. He was born in London in Lewisham in 1861, and he also is an Oxford man, but he went to Christchurch. He was ordained in 1886, served in a parish in Rochester for 3 years before joining the university's mission to Central Africa in 1889. During the first 7 years, he worked on the mainland in an area called Bombay. And during those years, he became proficient both in the local language, the Bombay language, and in Swahili. In 1897, he resigned from the mission so that he could marry a lady called Janet. All I know about Janet is her name and the fact she was a graduate of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford. The UMCA at that time only accepted single missionaries and expected priests to be celibate. Dale spent 5 years back in Britain serving in a parish in Newmarket, but then in 1902 the couple were accepted to go and work with the UMCA, with Janet going as a teacher. And Dale was appointed as a specialist on Islam and to work amongst Muslims based in Zanzibar on the island itself. Also with responsibilities at the cathedral, where initially he was a canon and then he became Archdeacon of Zanzibar. He retired from the mission field in 1920 due to poor health, but spent 3 or 4 years with the UMCA based in London in their office there until 1924, then worked in parishes, but all through the years until his death in 1941, he edited their house magazine, Central Africa. Now that's hopefully given you a little bit of an idea of who they were, but I particularly want to look at these 3 questions. What do we know of their approach to Islam and Muslims, and how were they received by the Muslim community? And then finally, how similar were they in their approach and attitude? And we return to William Taylor. I've put a map on the right-hand side of the screen showing Mombasa as an island. If you notice, slightly to the north of the island, there's a place called Freretown. That was a freed slave community established by CMS in the 1870s, and where most of the missionaries lived on the compound. Now, Taylor, during his first tour of duty, ran a clinic where he was able to use his medical experience gained when he studied in Edinburgh, but he didn't restrict himself to dealing with physical health. He took the opportunity to distribute copies of tracts to his patients. And in one of his letters, he wrote, "I've had many opportunities of preaching Christ in my medical practice. I've been able to lend Arabic works such as Al-Kindi and Fander's Mizan in quarters where they may do good. Of the Arabs resident in Mombasa, there are several said to be well disposed towards Christianity, but afraid to declare their belief." Now, rather than living on the mission compound in Freretown, Taylor chose to live in Mombasa town, which allowed him to spend time with the Swahili literati and to develop his understanding of Swahili as it was spoken and written in Mombasa. And in 1883, he explains his initial purpose for spending time in Mombasa. "My chief business there has hitherto been confined to the study of language. From my experience at Freretown, I can assure you that it was almost impossible to learn correct Swahili there. I found my stay in the town, Mombasa, the greatest benefit in improving my knowledge of Swahili." In 1891, in the introduction to his book, African Aphorisms or Saws from Swahili Land, Taylor pays tribute to his Swahili teachers and names 2 in particular: Mwalimu Sikujua ibn Abdallah al-Batawi, who was an accomplished poet, and Bwana Hemedi ibn Muhammad bin Sheikh al-Mambasi, who was an authority on prose. They had been able to guide Taylor's study of Swahili, and his willingness to learn seems to have endeared him to many local people. And Taylor also elsewhere reflected on the Swahili scholars who had helped him in his studies. Some able Mohammedan laymen, whose orthodoxy is looked upon here as beyond suspicion, leaders in the scrupulous observance of their religious rites and ceremonies, have not only discussed with us the claims we press upon them with patience, but have even lent their abilities to us in the service of our translational work. Now, an example of this he gives is that an accomplished scholar of Swahili and Arabic, who always formally had refused to give an opinion on linguistic questions where religion was involved, often just where we needed criticism and guidance. And the reason was because he feared he might be selling his soul. Taylor's interest in understanding the Swahili language led him to being warmly appreciated by the Swahili elders, who would sit with him on the baraza, or veranda of the mosque, to discuss the finer points of grammar and meaning of the language. However, his decision not to live on the mission compound in Freetown was not approved by many of his fellow missionaries, and possibly was seen as an indication that he was going native. After Taylor had spent 2 tours as a bachelor, in 1892 he returned with Catherine, his wife, and we get an insight into his relationship with the local community, the Muslim community. When news of his marriage reached Mombasa, one of Taylor's most prolific Swahili correspondents wrote to him in England saying that when the couple returned to Mombasa, they could, if they so wished, live in his refurbished house in Kisauni, and that his wife and Mrs. Taylor would be intimate friends. The Bishop Tucker, on their return, posted them to Mombasa town, together with a couple called the Gordons and the Mrs. Bazettes, the 3 ladies in that photograph. And the ladies lived in this house that's in the photograph, which was known as the Women Workers' House, or CMS Women Workers' House. And reports show that Mrs. Taylor and the other women visited ladies in the town and also supported the weekly outreach meetings, usually forming a choir and on occasion preaching. And they used the spacious basement of this house as their mskiti, mosque, he translates in his letter, but then explaining mission chapel and evangelistic hall. When the Taylors' first child was born, they received many congratulatory letters from the people of the town, and it's said that even the gentry of the town allowed time off for their slaves to have an ngoma, or a dance, to celebrate the occasion. Now, during Taylor's final tour, he was also involved in the public meetings, together with African clergy such as Isaac Semler, one of the first to be ordained by CMS, and also an Indian missionary who is described as a convert from Islam from a Pathan, and given the name of Sheikh Ali Baksh. These meetings were held either in the marketplace or in another place called Zizi Ta Konzi. And Taylor talks about these meetings. The marketplace was the private property of His Excellency the Arab Governor, and is a piece of land adjoining the bazaars. It is occupied in almost its whole extent by several large and high palm-leafed roof sheds, surrounded by the shady recesses of the gahawas, or coffee shops. Here we found a regular preaching site, to preach by word and song the gospel, which we know is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. To the Greeks foolishness, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Mohammedans both these. We have very varied experiences, although we often meet with ridicule and sometimes with bitter opposition and conflict. Wherever one goes, one hears the words, Taylor, Sizue, Taylor, don't tell lies, being the refrain of one of the most popular songs, a sort of parody of one of our choruses. And sometimes the opposition can be very noisy too. And he says that at that point he was suffering from an ear infection and had cotton wool stuffed into his ears. The quick-eyed opponent saw this and immediately objected, shouting, he's stopped his ears, he's afraid to hear our arguments. So of course I had to remove it. He also refers to the fact that he had been allowed to meet and argue with Mohammedan doctors on the very steps of the mosque porticos, wherein they give their lectures. and have been able, by God's blessing, to let them see some of the differences that lie between a soul-satisfying religion and the husky, strawy character of what they call Islam. Now, referring to the song, there is another interesting example of a song that there was a snatch of doggerel that was sung, and it said, Ibada ya Mola haiko sokoni. The worship of the Lord is not to be found in the marketplace. And Taylor's hymns were often parodied, but they had a particular rhythm which was referred to as Taylor's tune, and examples of them being used was found for many years and as far down the coast as Mozambique. The public meetings where Taylor and the others preached and the hymns were sung engaged with the local community, as they were a regular occurrence. They formed a part of the warp and weft of Mombasa life, no doubt seen as a distraction or entertainment by many people, although it's clear that for some it was an opportunity to challenge the message being presented and to debate with Taylor. Another thing he did on his return after his marriage was to begin working on a tract, Raha Isio Karaha, which he translates as meaning unhampered happiness or joy without alloy. The tract was first produced in 1893 in Swahili with Arabic script. And the first examples were printed in Mombasa, but the quality was so poor that they were unreadable. And finally, Taylor persuaded the Religious Tract Society in London to publish them, but again, in Swahili using Arabic script. However, soon after that, they were then transliterated into Roman script, and examples were reprinted right up to 1941 and were still available up to the 1950s. Having talked about Taylor, we now move on to our second missionary, Godfrey Dale, on Zanzibar. During his first tours, when Dale worked on the mainland, he clearly developed good language skills, as well as a strong sense that the most effective way to reach Africans for Christianity was through Africans themselves. And he also appears to have developed a strong bond with the African clergy, and the various records I found note that he presented a man called Cecil Majaliwa for his ordination during those years. I found one example of his interaction with Muslims during those years on the mainland. And in 1896, during a famine, Dale could not help asking a Mohammedan who came to buy rice why the rich Arabs, who know what true religion is, why don't they send you up rice? This Muslim then is said to have replied, "You have pity, but they have no pity." As I explained earlier, Dale resigned in 1897 in order to marry, but the records also show that during his first year back at home, he spent a term at Oxford studying Arabic and Islam. And his bishop, Bishop Hines, referred to this in a talk given to UMCA supporters in London, saying that there was a great need for Arabic in order to be able to work on Zanzibar. And UMCA, the mission, were aware of the need to have a specialist in Islam based in Zanzibar. And when Dale offered to return, he was selected for that role and to be based on Zanzibar Island in Zanzibar town in 1902. And in the September of 1903, so within a year of his arrival there, he gave a series of Sunday afternoon lectures in Christchurch Cathedral. And the title of the lectures was The Contrast Between Christianity and Mohammedanism. And reading the series of lectures, which were published and republished many times, it showed that Dale was widely read and knowledgeable about both Islam and Muhammad. And I've just put the titles of the 4 lectures there: Christianity and Mohammedanism, Christ and Muhammad, the Bible and Quran, the Spirit of Islam and the Spirit of Christianity. Now, having done one tour of 3 years in Zanzibar, he then returned to Britain for leave, but he spent that year in Oxford studying Arabic. And his obituary in the Church Times reports, on Dale's return to Zanzibar, he used Arabic continually, and his knowledge of the language became very great. It was his regular practice to meet Mohammedans, both Arabs and Africans, in public discussion, listening to all their arguments against Christianity and discovering the most effective ways of answering them. A more modern researcher, Randall Pools, reports that the discussions that Dale had with Muslims would have centered on subjects such as the divinity of Christ versus the miracles of Muhammad or Hussein, the crucifixion of Christ, the Holy Trinity, and Muhammad as the Paraclete. During these years, Dale also prepared 2 tracts in Swahili, Habari za Dini ya Kiislam, so news of the religion of Islam, or about the religion of Islam, and Maisha ya Muhammad, Life of Muhammad, which were both published in 1909. He also wrote and edited a number of other books, Darkness or Light in 1912, Tafsiri ya Quran ya Kiarabu, the Quran in Swahili, published in 1923, and then Islam in Africa, an introduction to the study of Islam for African Christians, published in 1925, so just at the point when he retired completely from UMCA. In reading round in preparation, I found 2 journal articles by Dale, which give us an insight into understanding his attitude to Islam and Muslims. I'll just talk about them both very briefly. Firstly, an article called Vital Elements in Islam, published in the International Review of Mission, which had only just been established following the Edinburgh Conference. Dale sets out aspects that he considered important with these following headings: dissatisfaction of individual Mohammedans with their faith on specific points, features in Christianity which appeal to the Muslim in East Africa, the presentation of the Christian faith to the Muslim, elements in Christianity which excite opposition, the influence of Mohammedanism on the character of the East African Muslim, and the light shed by Islam on Christianity. I want to quote from that final section where he writes, Christianity has benefited by contact with Mohammedanism. The Christian has been compelled to think about the exact meaning of his belief in the unity of God. Has been forced to think about the idea of the transcendence of God. Some perhaps have discovered that their belief in the providential dealings of God have become vague and tinged with doubt. They've been startled into self-examination by the Inshallah and the Alhamdulillah of the Muslim. They've also been reminded that religion is a power that touches life at all points and at all times, and cannot be kept in a separate compartment of the mind. The other journal article that I want to refer to is an article he published in the Muslim World in 1924, following the publication of his version of the Quran in Swahili. That's an image of it that I have there. I've just realized it's one I must have taken this image while I was still in Kenya. I do have a copy of the Quran myself, but anyway, he set out his reasons for producing a Swahili version of the Quran. Everything that is made manifest is light. If it is good, it is seen to be good. If it is evil, to be evil. There can be no satisfactory conclusion reached when much of the evidence required is hidden from view. Ignorance will be proved to be ignorance, and inaccuracy proved to be inaccuracy. The general African public will no longer be able to say, if these Christians could read the Quran, they might not remain Christian. Also, the general African public will know that what the Quran actually does teach on such subjects as slavery, polygamy, divorce, and will compare it with Christian teachings. Modern Islam in Africa is very largely unhistorical. We shall be very much surprised if our teachers do not make full use of the passages in the Quran which run counter to the extravagant belief of a later idealism with regard to Muhammad. You'll notice the image of a passage from Al Imran, that it's just in Swahili, but in Roman script, without the Arabic parallel passage. It is also not versified. The numbers in brackets refer to the most commonly available Arabic Quran in East Africa. And that was his reason for not using an Arabic parallel as we would expect in most versions today. But also there's another reason why the Quran did not become very successful and was seen as with suspicion. But Dale was of the view that a vernacular version of the Quran would be beneficial to the Muslim population, whose religious education chiefly consisted of parrot-like memorization of the Arabic text. However, not surprisingly, his work didn't make it into the government schools or the Quranic schools. It was used in the mission schools. The fact that Dale was not a Muslim and his reasons for producing a Quran in Swahili were viewed with suspicion, and his ability to understand Arabic and his style of writing in Swahili were also questioned. He has huge amounts of footnotes, which are, quite frankly, quite offensive in their interpretation of the text. So it's not surprising it wasn't popular. A later Muslim critic who prepared a Swahili version of the Bible wrote this in his foreword to his own version of the Quran. Some Muslim scholars suspected that Dale had intentionally twisted the translation so that it could be used for attacking the Quran. Now, having told you something about both these missionaries and their interaction with Muslims and Islam, can we come to any conclusions? What can we learn from them or about them? Well, they both valued the understanding of language, both the vernacular, that is the Swahili, and also the religious language, the Arabic. And they both valued spending time with local Muslims, possibly favoring the religious elite, and partially to improve their language skills, but also they wanted to engage with them. And it's clear that they both got to know Muslims well, and Taylor in particular seems to have been held in high regard, particularly because he lived in the community rather than across the creek on the mission compound. And they both had some knowledge and understanding of Islam. I would say Dale more than Taylor. Possibly, sorry, let me possibly they tended to use their knowledge in order to emphasize what was wrong with Islam rather than to discuss and to listen. So how successful was their approach? Today, few in East Africa will know their names, yet some aspects of what their approach can be seen as enduring. The need for friendship and a common language can be seen as positive, yet on a possibly less positive note, their combative public debating style also continues to be very popular, with Mihadra and Mujadala, where Muslims and Christians meet together and use each other's scriptures in order to convince the other of the truth. And these meetings continue and are organized both by Muslims and Christians, by local groups such as, and I've just chosen some examples as almost at random, the Muslim Preachers of the Bible and Sheepfold Ministries, as well as international organizations such as Islamic Propagation Center is International and Christ for All Nations. Taylor and Dale are examples to learn from, both what to do and what not to do, or what to avoid doing. Asanteni sana. So thank you very much.